Hey everyone, this is Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and now it's time for episode 180 of Album of the Day. It is like snowing outside a little bit as I am now doing this review. So today's band is a California-based rock band that definitely have been a pretty that are pretty well known for sort of bringing styles such as desert rock and stoner rock into the mainstream, and they definitely are by far one of the most inventive and one of the most one of the odder sort of hard rock bands that sort of emerged in the late 90s and gained their rise in popularity around the 2000s. Of course, the band that I'm talking about is Queens of the Stone Age. They've been around since like 1996 or 7, something like that. Kind of rose out of the ashes of a group that founding members Nick Oliveri and Josh Homme were in, called Caius, which was a pretty big part of that stoner rock movement that was kind of starting out around that time. But since then, they've definitely been experimenting a little more with their sound from there. And I'm here to review their latest record, which just came out on August the 25th of 2017. And the album is called Villains. And as you can see, I have this on vinyl. This is the limited edition artwork vinyl, of course. And an artist named Boneface did the artwork for the album, and definitely did a good job with creating the artwork. And this special edition artwork looks pretty cool because it's like light blue background, and there's like blood coming out of the eyes and the mouths of the different characters that are like on the album, which that would be Josh Homme on the album cover with a devil on him doing like a couple of middle fingers, which is pretty funny. And then there's the back. This is the rest of the band. So that's Troy Van Leeuwen, John Theodore, Dean Ferretta, and Michael Schumann. There's 9 tracks on the record. It's over 48 minutes long, and this is their second record for. They're actually signed to indie rock label Matador Records, which of course is currently also the label for artists like Perfume Genius and Algiers. And anyway, there's the inside, really nice gatefold, and then there's the liner notes. And this is actually produced by R&B and disco producer Mark Ronson, who lately has definitely been gaining quite a bit of popularity off of his hit song with Bruno Mars, Uptown Funk, which is a great song, definitely one of my favorite hit songs from 2015. And then there's side A, and there's side B. And anyway, these are the lyrics. What's so funny is I actually have the album on CD too, but it doesn't include an insert with lyrics, but I thought it was cool how in the vinyl they did include that. And that artwork of the devil on there, that's on the Evil Has Landed single that was off of this album. And then there's the other sleeve. There's side C, and what's really cool is there's some see-through artwork on the back, which was on the which was the artwork for the lead single off this record, The Way You Used to Do. Yeah, and that's the vinyl packaging for the new Queens of the Stone Age album, Villains. Now, this album definitely does see the band once again kind of tackling a new kind of sound here. And in this case, it's and it kind of makes sense because their last few LPs definitely did see the band kind of widening their repertoire a little bit. Like in 2013 with their last album, Like Clockwork, which wasn't their heaviest album yet, but it was definitely by far probably their dreariest and their most kind of dark and thematic and even depressing from a lyrical standpoint. I actually first got into this band in 2014 when I listened to that album, and I thought it was really good. It was definitely one of the best rock records of the decade, in my opinion, but it wasn't until a few years later when I finally kind of consistently started listening to this band's catalog more. Of course, I checked out Songs for the Deaf, which is an incredible album. Definitely check that out, even though I'm pretty sure all you alternative rock fans definitely have heard that album already. But, this album, they do once again sort of tackle a new kind of sound once again. They're not necessarily doing anything radically new, but they are sort of bringing in a little more grooves and a little more kind of more elements of glam rock, as well as even elements of dance and disco music, thanks to them working with Mark Ronson to co-produce the record and produce the record. So it's definitely kind of a much more kind of up-tempo and more optimistic and more kind of optimistic Queens of the Stone Age than what was present on their latest album. But the question is, does the QOTSA and Mark Ronson combo work? And, are the songs good? And it's good and whatnot. But, and the answer to all those questions would have to be yes. I definitely do really like this album. I think the songs are good. They're definitely on point. On point. And also I do see, of course, Josh Homme and Dean Ferretta had also worked with Iggy Pop on his latest record, Post-Pop Depression. So I definitely do see the Iggy Pop album is definitely kind of an influence on this album too. Like on the first song on the record, Feet Don't Fail Me Now, I actually heard that Iggy Pop actually came up with the title, and actually I heard it was supposed to be like the last song on Post-Pop Depression and whatnot, but, ended up being the opening track for this Queens of the Stone Age album. And what's interesting is how the song kind of starts out with kind of this by far their longest intro to date. It's definitely the kind of thing that's going to make more impatient listeners kind of pine for much more kind of immediate sort of start into the song. But I do think it is cool how it sort of shows how there's some sort of like mysterious groove that's sort of hidden under there, but it isn't until like after 2 minutes when it finally does kind of sort of kick in and really get the song going. And the song just transitions into just this total like groovy jam of a tune, which I definitely do really like. And in terms of the lyrics on this track, Joshua Homme definitely does have plenty of confidence, as he says how he feels like a dancing fool, footloose and fancy free. It definitely does show the band just kind of cutting loose, and cutting loose and just kind of letting it all out, which I definitely do think is really cool and it has a catchy little Bowie-inspired synth hook on there, which punctuates really nicely over the other instrumentation, the guitars, the bass, and the drums, which with you know, the kind of wah-wah guitars and drums, it definitely does have a good amount of sort of distorted, kind of rough Queens of the Stone Age swagger to it. But then it gets into this weird bridge, which features some kind of psychedelic filtering sound effects on Josh Homme's voice, which does sound really cool on there. And following that is the lead single on the record, The Way You Used to Do, which, of course, when the song came out, I did give it a listen, and I did eventually also find that weird video of Queens of the Stone Age Face the Truth, sort of like Liam Lynch using this lie detector on the band, and he asks, "Is your new album called Villains?" And Josh Homme's like, "No." No, which is pretty funny. Anyway, onto this track, The Way You Used to Do, which definitely does, it kind of makes sense they dropped this as the lead single, because it definitely does have kind of the groovy, sort of laid-back vibes that are definitely presented really well on the album. It's got this really cool, sort of peppy, kind of clap electronic beat going on the track. And what I think is really essential to the song is the layers of guitars, the way they kind of stack up and just create this really like a cool, just sort of instantly kind of memorable and like a drilling kind of melody, pretty much. Melody, pretty much. And this song lyrically is kind of like a love song to like Josh Homme's like a wife, who is Brody Dalle, for those who didn't know. And it definitely has a nice bit of hookiness to it from the riff, and it's definitely a song that pretty much just shows all the things that make Queens of the Stone Age such an admirable band, from band to begin with, from the kind of rough edge to the kind of sexiness about it. Definitely a cool song. Then we have Domesticated Animals, which is definitely one of my favorite tracks on the record. Definitely one song that definitely has almost kind of definitely has kind of an 80s inspired groove to it, which sounds really nice. And lyrically, it's sort of a song kind of about how we all kind of feel like animals that are kind of essentially kind of domesticated animals, pretty much. And how when we are that way, bewilderness just kind of comes to reclaim everything. Sort of wondering if we're like feral or tame, and sort of wondering where the gold is and whatnot. While this record may not be as much a focus on lyrics as it is on like kind of the musical grooves and whatnot, I do think it is pretty interesting, the point that Josh Homme makes on this song about how we're all essentially kind of domesticated animals in this world, pretty much. And also do really like some of the other instrumentation they work into the groove as well, like these really nice, sexy sort of strings that kind of sweep in the bridge, sound really nice. And also we get this pretty cool distorted scream at the end from their bass player, who is Michael Schumann. And then following that, some pretty somber strings that transition pretty well into the next song, Fortress, even though this song is probably my least favorite track on the record. I mean, I do really like kind of sort of the upbeat, hooky grooviness of the track in terms of the instrumental and whatnot. Definitely it has a nice catchy chorus to it, but I will admit that the lyrics of your heart being like this fortress to hide your feelings in and whatnot is just kind of superficial and just leaves me feeling kind of but the very next song, however, Head Like a Haunted House. Man, this song is just a lot of fun to listen to. It's definitely got a nice it definitely does a good job of really sort of allowing you to really have fun with the band, pretty much. With the cool grooving drum part from John Theodore on there, as well as the catchy little guitar riffs, which it actually has a little bit of a hip-hop sort of feel to it, but I think it's incorporated really nicely over some kind of over a stoner rock lens, pretty much. And I love sort of the kind of off-the-wall sort of phrases that Josh Homme is kind of spitting out into the microphone, like kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it sounds just really cool on there. And I also do really like the kind of siren-y female backup vocals on the track, as well as the occasional shouts of, "You okay?" I think that is pretty funny and definitely an awesome track for sure. For sure. And it's cool that, you may not know exactly, what he's trying to, say with his phrases, but still at the same time, it still managed to be memorable and kind of hilarious, I will admit. The song Unreborn, again, sort of is another song kind of addressing how we kind of are portrayed in society, pretty much. So how we feel kind of frozen in pose and locked up in amber eternally. Yeah, and I do think it is interesting how he mentions all these different people with kind of their special needs, and in order to feel satisfied that they can never really get, pretty much. So pretty much, and I do really like, this is definitely one song that has kind of a funky sort of groove to it that I do think is really nice on there, and it's on there. So I like how the album, it is definitely kind of a rock and roll record, but definitely taken as much inspiration from kind of dancier types of music as possible. And this is one song that features some pretty cool, lavish sort of additional instrumentation incorporated in there. I like how the strings on the song are sort of incorporated to sound more like drums, essentially. I mean, they're played not really in the typical style of a string section, but the way that they kind of pulse, the actually has a pulse similar to that of percussion, which definitely is really cool and creative right there. And I also like how with the filtering that's put on there kind of makes you feel as if you're being swallowed by it, as well as there's this kind of distorted baritone sax that plays in the second part of the chorus, which does sound pretty nice, as well as some kind of off-kilter sax stylings at the end that sound pretty nice. Nice, and there are definitely different kind of shifts and changes that happen in the song, like like for example, the lead vocal becomes a background vocal, the background singers become kind of the lead part in there. Then we have the song Hideaway, which definitely is the one track that probably takes the most inspiration from 80s kind of like dance music. I do really like the kind of peppy synth lead that plays along in the song. That definitely does become pretty memorable from the beginning. The drums have kind of a bit of an 80s feel to them, with there's part live drums in the mix, as well as some sequence drums that are kind of worked into there really nicely. Really nicely. And this is another song that really, majority of the songs on this album are probably some of the closest the band has come to love songs, but at the same time, they do really work over the kind of catchy, dancey instrumentals they create. And this song also has a pretty cool guitar solo on there too. It's definitely nice to see the band kind of pay tribute to Bowie a little bit with this album, because he is definitely quite a legend, and after he passed, he's definitely become that much more of a big deal to the people, a lot of musicians that are really influenced by him. So I definitely do appreciate that coming from Queens. And I like how this is a song that kind of addresses love. This is an album that also at the same time addresses love in sort of a kind of introspective but very smart sort of way, like on this track, for example. And this is one song where I feel one of the best examples of them sort of incorporating the Mark Ronson influence on here. But following that, it's probably my favorite track on the record, which is the song The Evil Has Landed. I mean, this song, man, it's such a jam. Like, I definitely was excited, got even more excited for this album when hearing this track. Like, it definitely has just a really unique musical structure to it. It's like this little like journey to the point where you can't really edit the song or try to listen to part of it. You kind of have to listen to the whole thing, because it really does make that much more sense to me. And it just jams pretty hard with the Led Zeppelin inspired riffs, as well as John Theodore's drumming definitely does punctuate and drive the groove of the song really well, really showing off his skills as a drummer. And he's formerly the drummer from the Mars Volta. It's Volta, for those who didn't know. A nice fuzzy, sexy bass line on the track too. Track 2, and there are just so many different parts of the song that I really do gravitate to a lot, including Troy Van Leeuwen puts out this kind of puts out just one hell of a guitar solo, I do find, on here. The female backup vocals are definitely incorporated really nicely into kind of the hookiness of the verses, for sure. But then it eventually transitions into this really cool kind of testosterone-fueled outro. With some kind of distorted vocals, and it definitely does close out the song on the best note, definitely making this very much one of the standout cuts on the album. But then following that is probably the most Like Clockwork-esque moment on the entire album, which is the song Villains of Circumstance. But, only difference is not quite as melancholy as what was present on that record. But this song is definitely a really beautiful ballad to close out the album, and it definitely is feel like a nice triumphant finish for the record. Definitely want to make this probably one of the greatest Queens of the Stone Age songs that's pretty much been written. It's been written. Like, it does seem like, kind of dark and melancholy from the verses, but then it eventually does a good job kind of taking an a nice kind of optimistic turn in the verses, pretty much. It definitely has a good sort of triumphant catchiness to it with the guitars, the piano, and that synth line definitely does sound really nice in there too. And I do really like the kind of brooding bass line on the track too. To really beautiful synth strings in the middle, creating this kind of somber solo, which sounds really nice. And I do really like the kind of emotional vocal performance that he delivers on the song, especially with the final line in the second verse of it's so hard to explain, so easy to feel. I need you now, nothing is real. Save me from the villains of circumstance before I lose my place. And the song does close out with kind of an odd outro featuring either this guitar or keyboard that has a bit of a kind of a Middle Eastern sort of tone to it, but it actually does work really well, and it was kind of a funny way to close out the record. And that triumphant chorus definitely does transition into it oddly pretty well. So yeah, I definitely do really really love this album overall. It does have kind of its shortcomings. Probably the biggest issue I have with this album would have to be the production of the drums and the mixing of this album. It isn't necessarily the best, even though they did a good job sort of incorporating kind of his Mark Ronson's bone-dry production style. It does work with this band, but and I will admit, John Theodore does deliver some pretty shining performances on the drum kit. But I will admit, the kind of rough distortion that's on the drums, it kind of thins out the drums in a way that I don't quite care for. It kind of lacks in the drums kind of lack in substance a little bit because of the sound. Like, if there was a little more bass drum sort of worked in there, it definitely would have sounded a lot better, even though overall, that problem isn't glaring enough to keep me from really enjoying this record, because overall there's definitely a lot of pretty big selling points here on this album, and I definitely do recommend you give it a listen. I know it may be kind of polarizing to some fans, but personally I do think it is cool to see the band once again kind of widening the palette. So yeah, I'm gonna give Villains an 8 out of 10 for sure. So that's my review of the new Queens of the Stone Age album, Villains. I'll see you for episode 181.